Have you ever watched someone you love be treated like a criminal when you knew in your heart they were innocent? Not just questioned, not just investigated, but humiliated in front of neighbors who had known you for years in front of children who did not understand why men in uniforms were searching your house, tearing through drawers and closets and lifting floorboards as if your husband, the man who had just come home from war, the man who had survived Normandy and the Bulge and marched through Germany, was somehow a threat to the very country he had bled for? I was 23 years old, standing in the doorway of our small house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on a cold morning in March of 1946, watching two Army investigators walk up our front steps with faces like stone, and I knew even before they spoke, even before they showed me the papers authorizing them to search our home, that everything was about to change. My husband Daniel had been home for exactly 47 days. 47 days of trying to sleep without nightmares, of jumping at loud noises, of staring at walls with eyes that saw things I could not see. 47 days of learning how to be married to a stranger who wore my husband's face, but spoke less, smiled less, existed less than the man who had left in 1943. The lead investigator, a captain whose name I do not remember, but whose eyes I will never forget, cold and certain and utterly without mercy, asked if Daniel was home. I said yes. He asked if they could come in. I said I did not think I had a choice. And they walked into our home, into the small living room where Daniel was sitting in his chair by the window, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, trying so hard to be normal, to be the husband I remembered to be something other than haunted. And the captain said, "Sergeant Daniel Morrison, we need you to come with us for questioning regarding events that occurred during your service in the European theater. You are not under arrest at this time, but your cooperation is mandatory." Daniel stood up slowly, carefully, as if one wrong move might shatter him. He looked at me. Just looked. And in that look I saw shame and fear and something else, something that looked like resignation, like he had been waiting for this moment. Like he had known it would come eventually, and now that it was here, he was almost relieved to stop pretending. The neighbors watched from their windows as Daniel was led to an army vehicle parked at our curb. Mrs. Henderson from next door came out onto her porch, arms crossed, face pinched with judgment. The Kowalski boys stopped playing catch in the street and stared. Mr. Chen, who ran the corner store and had always given Daniel free cigarettes because he was a veteran, turned away when our eyes met, as if looking at me would somehow contaminate him. And I stood there, 23 years old, pregnant with our first child, a fact I had only discovered 2 weeks earlier and had not yet told Daniel because I was waiting for the right moment, waiting for him to seem less broken, less lost. And I learned something that morning that I would carry for the next 59 years. That shame is contagious. That guilt spreads like disease, that when someone you love is accused of something, you are accused too, tried to, convicted to, even if you have done nothing wrong except love them. But that was only the beginning. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, why it would lead me to a courthouse in Philadelphia 6 months later, where I would finally understand what Daniel had done, what he had witnessed, what he had been carrying in silence because he did not know how to speak it, let me take you back. Let me show you who we were before the war, before the army, before the world decided that heroism could look like treason and courage could look like crime. I met Daniel in 1941 at a church dance in Harrisburg. I was 18, working at a textile mill, living with my parents and 3 younger sisters in a row house on 2nd Street. He was 20, working construction, saving money to buy land somewhere, to build something with his own hands. He was quiet but not shy, serious but not grim. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke and who, when he did speak, said things that mattered. We married in June of 1942, a small ceremony at St. Mary's with my family and his mother, his father having died when Daniel was 15, leaving him to be the man of the house too early to carry weight he should not have had to carry. We rented a small house on Maple Street, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that looked out onto a backyard where Daniel said we would plant tomatoes and beans and maybe apple trees if we stayed long enough. We had 6 months together before he enlisted. 6 months of learning how to be married, how to share space and money and dreams, how to negotiate whose family we would visit on Sundays, and whether we wanted children right away or wanted to wait a few years. 6 months of ordinary happiness, the kind that feels so unremarkable when you are living it but becomes precious beyond measure once it is gone. Daniel left for basic training in January of 1943. He wrote me letters, dozens of them, describing the cold at Fort Dix, the exhaustion of training, The strange camaraderie of men who had nothing in common except the fact that they were all about to face something none of them could fully imagine. And then the letters changed. They became shorter, less descriptive, more careful. He was overseas, that much I knew, but where exactly and what he was doing, that was classified, that was secret. That was something I was supposed to accept without question, because that was what patriotic wives did, what good women did, what we all did. Because the alternative was unthinkable. He came home in January of 1946, thinner than I remembered, harder somehow, as if all the softness had been burned away and only the essential parts remained. He did not want to talk about the war. He did not want to go to parades or ceremonies or gatherings at the WW where other veterans traded stories and drank beer and tried to make sense of what they had seen. He wanted to work, to build, to use his hands, to create things rather than destroy them. He got a job at the same construction company he had worked for before the war, and every morning he would leave at 6 and come home at 5, covered in dust and sweat, and he would wash his hands at the kitchen sink for a long time, longer than necessary, as if he were trying to scrub away something that would not come off. Have you ever felt something like this? That sense that the person you love is carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. But they will not let you help carry it, will not even tell you what it is, will only insist they are fine, that everything is fine, that you should not worry. I worried about the nightmares that woke him gasping and trembling at 2 in the morning. I worried about the way he flinched when doors slammed or cars backfired. I worried about the distance in his eyes, the way he could be sitting right next to me but feel miles away, lost in memories I could not access, could not understand, could not share. And then the army came. And suddenly everyone else was worried too, but not about Daniel's pain, about what the war had done to him. They were worried about what he might have done during the war, what crimes he might have committed, what secrets he might be hiding. The investigation was supposed to be confidential, but nothing stays confidential in a small community. Within a week, everyone knew that Daniel was being questioned about possible war crimes, about something that had happened in a German village. In April of 1945, about civilians who had died in orders that may or may not have been followed. No one knew the details, but details did not matter. The accusation was enough. People stopped hiring Daniel for construction work. They said it was about the economy, about having enough workers already, about not needing extra help right now, but I knew the truth. They did not want a potential war criminal building their houses, working in their neighborhoods, existing near their families. The man at the hardware store started watching Daniel carefully whenever he came in, as if he might steal something or cause trouble. The priest at St. Mary's suggested gently, kindly, with deep regret, that perhaps we might be more comfortable attending a different church, at least until the investigation was resolved, because some of the parishioners were uncomfortable, were concerned, had questions that he could not answer. And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. I stopped being the quiet, obedient, understanding wife who smiled and nodded and accepted what she was told without question. I started asking questions. I demanded to speak with the investigators. I demanded to know what Daniel was accused of, what evidence they had, why my husband, who had served honorably, who had medals in a box under our bed that he never looked at because they reminded him of things he did not want to remember, was being treated like a criminal. And they told me, finally, reluctantly, after I had called and written letters and showed up at their office 3 times in 1 week, that Daniel was being investigated because he had disobeyed a direct order. In April of 1945, Daniel's unit had been ordered to secure a German village suspected of harboring SS officers. The order was to eliminate all resistance, to show no mercy, to make an example that would discourage other villages from protecting enemy combatants. But when Daniel's squad entered the village, they found no SS officers. They found old men and women and children, refugees who had fled from the east. People who were starving and terrified and had nothing to do with the war except that it had destroyed their lives. And Daniel's commanding officer, a lieutenant whose name was redacted from the documents, but whom Daniel would later describe as a man who enjoyed cruelty. who saw the war as permission to exercise power without consequences, ordered them to execute the civilians anyway. To send a message, to follow orders, and Daniel refused. Not loudly. Not with speeches about morality or justice or the rules of war. He simply said no. And then he convinced the other 7 men in his squad to say no too. And they let the civilians go, gave them what food they could spare, pointed them toward the American lines where they might find safety, and filed a false report saying the village had been empty, abandoned, already evacuated. They covered for each other, protected each other, carried the secret together for almost a year. And then one of the men, a private named Kellerman who had been struggling with guilt, who had been drinking too much and talking too much, had confessed to a chaplain who had reported it to command, who had launched an investigation into whether Daniel and his squad had committed insubordination, dereliction of duty, and potentially treason by aiding the enemy. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. Not because the investigation would be resolved quickly or fairly, but because I made a decision. I decided that silence was not protection. I decided that shame was not something I had to accept. I decided that if the army wanted to investigate my husband for refusing to murder civilians, then they could investigate me too, because I would. Not stand quietly by while they tried to make heroism look like cowardice and morality look like treason. Stay with me until the end, it's worth it. I contacted a lawyer, a man named Samuel Goldstein, who had served in World War I and who understood in a way that civilians could not what war does to men, what impossible choices soldiers face, what it means to follow orders, and what it means to defy them. He agreed to represent Daniel pro bono, not because we could not afford him, though we could not, but because he believed as I did, that what Daniel had done was right, was brave, was exactly what we should want soldiers to do when confronted with orders that violate every principle we claim to fight for. The hearing was held in Philadelphia in September of 1946. It was closed to the public, but I was allowed to attend as Daniel's wife. I sat in the back of the room, 6 months pregnant now, visibly showing, and I watched as they tried to break him. They questioned him for hours, asking why he disobeyed, why he thought he knew better than his commanding officer, why he prioritized enemy lives over military objectives, why he thought the rules of war did not apply to him. And Daniel, my quiet, serious, broken husband, answered every question with the same calm clarity. He said he disobeyed because the order was illegal, because the Geneva Conventions prohibited the murder of civilians, because his conscience would not allow him to kill people who posed no threat. He said he knew the consequences, had always known, had been waiting for this moment since April of 1945. And he said he would do it again. That if faced with the same choice, he would make the same decision, because living with guilt for disobeying an order was better than living with guilt for murdering children. The room was silent when he finished, and I realized that this was the first time I had heard Daniel speak with such certainty since he came home. The first time his voice had not been haunted, hesitant, lost. The investigation had done something unexpected. It had given him permission to speak the truth, to name what he had done, to claim it as something to be proud of rather than something to hide. And I understood then that the shame he had been carrying was not shame about what he had done, but shame about whether what he had done was right, whether it made him a good soldier or a bad one, whether refusing to commit atrocity made him brave or just weak in a world that valued obedience over conscience. The army dropped the charges in November of 1946. Not because they believed Daniel was right, but because prosecuting him would have been politically disastrous. The Nuremberg trials were underway, and the Allies were arguing that following orders was not a defense for war crimes, that soldiers had a moral obligation to refuse illegal orders, that obedience to authority could not justify atrocity. To prosecute Daniel for doing exactly what we were saying the German soldiers should have done would have exposed the hypocrisy, would have undermined the entire legal framework we were building to hold the Nazis accountable. So they quietly closed the investigation, sealed the records, and told Daniel he was free to go, as if freedom were something they had the power to grant rather than something he had claimed for himself when he said no to that lieutenant in a German village in April of 1945. But the damage was done. Not to Daniel's record, not to his legal status, but to our life in Harrisburg. People did not forget, people did not apologize. They just pretended it had never happened, pretended they had never doubted him, never avoided us, never suggested we find another church. And we could have stayed, could have tried to rebuild, could have forced ourselves back into a community that had shown us exactly what their loyalty was worth. But we chose differently. We chose to leave. We moved to Oregon in 1947, as far from Harrisburg as we could get without leaving the country. We bought land 5 acres outside of Portland, and Daniel built our house with his own hands. Board by board, nail by nail, creating something solid and permanent and real. Our daughter Elizabeth was born in February of 1947, and our son, Thomas, in 1949, and Daniel was a good father. Patient and present and gentle in ways that surprised me because I had not seen much gentleness in him since the war. But it was there, buried deep, waiting for permission to emerge. He never talked about the hearing. He never talked about the village or the civilians he saved or the lieutenant who had ordered their deaths. But he did talk about the 7 men in his squad, the ones who had said no with him, who had chosen conscience over obedience. He kept in touch with all of them for the rest of his life, writing letters, making phone calls, visiting when we could afford the travel. They were his brothers in a way that went deeper than blood, bonded not by what they had survived, but by what they had refused to do, by the line they had drawn together and held even when the cost was shame, suspicion, investigation, potential court-martial. Share this with someone who would understand. Because Daniel died in 2003 at the age of 81, and at his funeral, those 7 men, the ones who were still alive, came to Oregon to honor him. They were old men now bent with age marked by time, but they stood together at his grave and they told stories. I had never heard stories about other moments when they had chosen right over easy, when they had protected the vulnerable rather than exploited them, when they had carried forward the lesson Daniel had taught them in that German village, that humanity matters more than hierarchy, that conscience matters more than obedience, that the true measure of a soldier is not whether he follows orders but whether he follows his moral compass when the two conflict. And I realized, standing there listening to these men honor my husband, that the investigation had not been the end of our story but the beginning. That the shame we had carried, the suspicion we had endured, the community we had lost, those were not prices we paid for Daniel's choice, but proof that his choice had meaning, had consequence, had required real courage. Because anyone can be brave when bravery looks heroic, when it comes with medals and parades and universal approval. The harder bravery, the kind that matters most, is the kind that looks like disobedience, that costs you something, that leaves you standing alone while everyone else falls in line. I am 86 years old now. I live in the house Daniel built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who know his story, who understand that their grandfather was not just a veteran, but a man who believed that some things are worth more than orders, worth more than advancement, worth more than approval. I tell them about the investigation, about the hearing, about the moment he said he would do it again. And I tell them that respect does not erase the past, does not undo the shame or the suspicion or the cost of standing up when everyone else sits down. But respect teaches us how to breathe again. It teaches us that we can live with the consequences of our choices when those choices are rooted in conscience rather than fear. It teaches us that integrity is not about being perfect or popular or approved of by authority, but about knowing who you are and refusing to betray that knowledge even when betrayal would be easier. My husband returned from World War II in January of 1946. And 2 months later, the army sent someone to question him about whether he had committed treason by refusing to murder civilians. And for 47 days between his return and that investigation, I thought the war had broken him, had taken the man I loved and replaced him with someone hollowed out and haunted. But I was wrong. The war had not broken him, it had tested him. And he had passed. Not by killing more efficiently, not by following orders more obediently, not by becoming harder or colder or more capable of violence, but by drawing a line and saying this far and no further, by protecting the vulnerable when he could have destroyed them, by choosing humanity when authority demanded cruelty. And I learned something from him from that experience, from watching him be accused and investigated, and ultimately vindicated not by the army, but by history, by the slow recognition that what he did in that German village was exactly what soldiers should do when faced with illegal orders. I learned that courage is not always loud. It is not always celebrated. It does not always come with medals or recognition or even acknowledgement. Sometimes courage is just saying no when everyone else says yes. Sometimes courage is standing alone and accepting the consequences because the alternative is betraying yourself. Sometimes courage is living with shame and suspicion and doubt, not because you have done something wrong, but because you have done something right that others are not ready to understand. Truth does not shout. It does not demand validation or approval or immediate recognition. Truth simply waits to be heard. It waits through investigations and hearings and sealed records. It waits through decades of silence and careful avoidance and unspoken questions. And when we are ready, when we are brave enough, when we decide that knowing the truth matters more than protecting comfortable lies, truth speaks, not to punish, not to divide, but to remind us that we are capable of more than we think, that conscience is stronger than authority, that love means standing beside someone even when the world stands against them. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here. These are the stories that do not fit neatly into narratives about heroism and honor, that complicate our understanding of what it means to serve, that ask difficult questions about obedience and morality and the space between them. And if you have stayed with me until this moment, if you have heard my story and recognized something in it, something that resonates with your own experience of standing beside someone the world has judged, then you understand why these stories matter. They matter because they remind us that judgment is easy and understanding is hard, that accusations can spread faster than truth. That shame is something we inflict on others when we are afraid to examine our own complicity. And don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.